Today is September 5th, 2024. My name is Alan Vendel, and this show is Political Dharma. Welcome once again. It is just 4 weeks and a couple of days until the close of voting in the November election, and it looks like a very close race between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Kamala Harris. That will be decided by a handful of voters in a handful of swing states. So all the rest of us are just sitting, waiting and watching to see what will happen. As far as the alternative candidates, that is those former or current candidates who are independents and minor party candidates, I don't have a lot of stories, just a few brief ones this week. It looks like it's pretty well set who's going to be on the ballot where and how many people might be voting for them. Of course, the minor party candidates are all still talking about trying to get 5% of the popular votes so that they will have a leg up in future elections with some public funding. But I'm really watching just to see if any of them can break 2%. If they do, I will be happy that it shows there is significant voter discontent with the two-party system. Most of today, I'm going to be talking about the effort to change the two-party system to open primaries. Now, that's a much more complex subject than ranked choice voting, which I discussed last week, in itself a complicated subject, because the terminology in the open primary discourse is not very well settled. So I'm going to try to walk you through that. But first up, we have a couple of short stories about former candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., candidate Jill Stein, and a couple other things. So very briefly, last week I presented a story that said that it looked like the former Robert F. Kennedy Jr. supporters, or I wouldn't say former, but those who are planning to vote for him, about a little over half of them have moved over to Trump. Now, I caution that that article was based on just an informal survey of a very few people, so it wasn't much to rely on. Again, I'll caution you on this week's story, which is from The Atlantic, which would seem to be a much more reliable source for news. But as it turns out, okay, this article, this is where you end up when you do your own research. So you can already tell from the title what kind of slant they're going to have on it. On the National Mall with the RFK to mega pipeline. So this is going to be a story about the voters migrating from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to Donald Trump. Here's a passage from that article, and I've highlighted the important thing, that this is from Kennedy's team. It says they've conducted informal polling. Now, I don't know what they mean by informal polling, but it sounds like it's not a very careful methodology for determining what's happening. But they found that roughly 60% of his fans would vote for Trump. About 40% of them are still needing convincing. And of that 40%, he believes about 20 to 25%, so a little over half of them, are moving toward Trump. He also acknowledged that 5% of Kennedy supporters may never get behind Trump under any circumstance. Now, I bring this up because it mirrors what that article I discussed last week says, which is that a little over half of Kennedy's voters, and who knows how many of them are even left, when he dropped out of the race, suspended his campaign, he was running, I think, at about 2% in the national polls, have no idea what his real support level is and how many of those are going over to Donald Trump. But it looks like from the very unreliable indications we have that a lot of them are following his plea to go to Trump. Of course, a lot of them were Trump supporters to begin with. They were just looking for somebody who was not actually Trump. So they're not too dead set against him. Down there in that second paragraph, though, I didn't highlight this, but I did want to point it out. The reporter says that hardly anyone I spoke with seemed excited at the prospect of voting for Trump. And in the previous sentence, he finds that talking to people at this rally, the ratio appeared roughly correct. So people that are trying to get a rough count of what's happening in the Kennedy supporters, they're finding out that a little over half of them are going to Trump. Now, what's happening with the minor parties? Jill Stein, who was unable to get on the ballot in New York State, because they have such a high number of signatures required, their Green Party in New York is doing a very well-funded, coordinated write-in campaign. At least that's how they're announcing it. Here's a title from the Independent Political Report. Green Party of New York launches statewide write-in campaign around presidential ticket for ballot access. And I've highlighted the part that shows you how, I don't want to say desperate, but how determined the major parties are to keep minor parties out of the picture. In 2020, the new state ballot access requirements were introduced in New York, raising the qualification threshold from 5,000 signatures to 45,000. Now, if my basic math back in grammar school is right, that's about 9 times. That is exactly 9 times what it used to be. So they made it 9 times harder for minor parties to get the signatures they need to get on the ballot. Additionally, the number of votes needed to retain ballot access, I'm reading once again, rose from 50,000 to 2% of the total vote cast, or 130,000 votes from a gubernatorial or presidential election. So also trying to retain your ballot access as a party, assuming you can get it and hold on to it in the first place, has become harder as well. You have to be able to get about 130,000 votes in a statewide election, such as for governor and president, up from 50,000 previous elections. So once again, we see that the states, which are run by the major parties, are not at all friendly to competition in our very democratic republic. That's a sarcastic statement, or ironic, or both. Let's move on to something else here, which is some people have asked me, and it's often been a question of, do these minor parties, like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, do they just pop up with a presidential candidate every 4 years and do nothing in between? No, that's not true. I know in the Green Party, and I assume for the Libertarian Party, they have a host of people who have been elected at the local level, especially in nonpartisan, I think almost exclusively in nonpartisan races. I get the sense that having the party label is actually a detriment to getting elected. People would rather vote for an independent or someone whose party they cannot identify than for somebody who has the name of a party they barely know about or just regard as perennial losers behind their name. Anyway, there are several also minor party candidates in the Congress. This is from Third Party Watch, and they did a count from Ballot Access News, actually, so both news agencies were involved, or news websites. Libertarian Party has 71 candidates in the U.S. House, for the U.S. House of Representatives. That might include the Senate, I'm not sure. So let's say 71 candidates for the U.S. Congress. Green Party has 34. The Constitution Party has 17 candidates, and there's a few others from other parties. So it's not the case that they never run candidates for lower offices or even, higher, but lower than the presidency, high offices lower than the presidency. There are a lot of candidates that they field that really just don't get very far. They're always hoping to maintain their ballot access and to build on their support, but maybe this is the year of their breakthrough, maybe not. One other article from way back in March, this is from Ballot Access News. I thought this was a good time to bring this up as well. In California here, we have an open primary, according to the terminology that's currently in use, in which all candidates from all parties run in the same primary, and all voters from all parties or no party can pick which of those candidates they want to vote to get to the general election. And there is one state district in the state assembly, the 18th district up in Oakland, actually a candidate of the American Independent Party, a very little known, unless you've been watching my show, you might know something about it. Very little known party from way back in the era of George Wallace in 1968, did get a candidate through the top 2 process. That is, they came in second in the open primary, so along with the Democrat who got more votes, they're both going to be on the general election ballot, rather than a Democrat and Republican, which is the usual case in a top 2 system, or 2 from the same party, which is the second most common case in a top 2 election. You have a minor party candidate that got through this process. Now I'm going to come back to this when I talk about the open primary movement, because I think it's an important indicator. What you see here in the article is that the Democrat had 73,000 votes in that primary, and the 2 Republicans had a little over 4,000 each, which means if only one Republican had been running, that candidate would likely have gotten over 8,000 votes and came in second instead of the American Independent Party candidate who got 5,200 something votes. So 5,000 2024. That's interesting because that's this year. Anyway, the American Independent Party candidate came in second with 5,000 votes, and the two Republicans split their votes, the Republican vote, between them and kept them out of the general election. So keep that in mind when I come to discussing open primaries. All right, so that is my, I'm covered up by that. That is my very brief report on what's been happening in the campaigns. You know, the candidates are campaigning, and, you know, Jill Stein's been on various podcasts here and there, and Chase Oliver is around speaking to people, and Cornel West and the rest. They're all still doing the campaigning thing, but not a lot. I don't think there's going to be a lot of news between here and the election. It'll be after the election when we see how each of them did that I'll have more to say about those candidates. So let us turn now to another type of reform of our voting system that's meant to primarily help independent voters have more say in who actually gets on the ballot in November. So to do that, first of all, I'm going to have to go into the nomenclature, that is the naming process, because the old definition of open primary meant one thing, and more recently, people are using that term open primary to mean something a bit different. So this is going to get confusing because different people are using different terminology, and I will try to straighten it out for you as best I can. To start out with, and this is a problem too with ranked choice voting, not as big a problem, but one that people frequently object to, that is people who are well versed in different voting methods. When I use the term ranked choice voting, that caught on around 2015 or so. I started using it myself without any outside influence because I thought it was more voter friendly, and Fair Vote around the same time independently started using it. The previous term was instant runoff voting, which is one form of counting a ranked choice ballot. Let me back that up. I wasn't going to go into ranked choice voting too deeply, but ranked choice voting simply means voters get to rank candidates on their ballot. And this is important to do a review because it will intersect with the open primary movement. So in any ranked choice voting method, voters get to rank candidates, first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. But the way of counting those rankings is different in different forms of ranked choice voting. The one that has been spreading across the United States and has been used in a lot of other places had been called instant runoff voting, but it wasn't a very informative name. Ranked choice voting indicates to voters how they fill out their ballot, whereas instant runoff, it's hard to tell what that means. So the movement changed the name to ranked choice voting, which has now become what people recognize as the name for this form of voting. But you will still have people objecting that it is not the only form of ranked choice voting, the one that's actually spreading around the country. So turning back to the naming problem in open primaries, let's look at that for a minute. Let's go back to the old way of using the term open primaries. Okay, let me fit that on the screen a little better. There we go. So in the old way of talking about this, an open primary was one in which any voter could choose which party's primary to participate in. So a primary meaning a public election run by the state, and usually they only run primaries for the major parties, the Democrats and Republicans. In a state that had an open primary, they don't typically register voters by party. That is, you register, but you don't have to indicate a party preference as a voter. So then when the primary comes around to determine the nominees of the major party, you can choose which party you want to have the ballot from. Doesn't really matter what your political predilections are or your political ideology or leanings. You can choose to vote in either major party's primary, but only in one of them. So an open primary is one in which voters are not tied to parties and they can decide which major party they want to help choose the nominee in. Now, the easiest way to understand this is in distinction to what had been called and still is called a closed primary. In a closed primary, you register as a voter with a party, and only those voters who are registered with a particular major party can actually vote in that party's primary. Now, that's the most familiar, I think, to most of us. So in order to vote for in the Democratic Party's primary, you have to be registered as a Democratic voter. Same is true for the Republican Party. As for everybody else, people who are not affiliated with the party, or people who are registered as a minor party follower, then you don't get to vote in the major party nominations. So the rap against this, and this is because in recent decades, fewer and fewer people have affiliated with the major parties. So there's a huge swathe of voters, a lot of them not affiliated with any party, who don't have any say in who the candidates are going to be in the general election. We know the big names are going to be the Democrat and Republican, but if the Democrat is chosen by a very small percentage of the voters, that is, the Democratic Party represents maybe a third of the total voting population, and a less than unanimous consent of the Democrats is helping choose that nominee, it's a very small percentage of the voting population choosing each of the major parties' candidates. Those are going to be the big candidate names on the ballot, and lots of people can't participate in that. So that's what a closed primary is, and why it's become problematic that fewer and fewer people are affiliating with the major parties. So a semi-closed primary, which is, now this is one of the confusing parts, is also called a semi-open primary. So semi means halfway, right? Halfway between an open primary and closed primary. That is, you can register by party, and only Democrats can vote in the Democratic Party, and only Republicans vote in the Republican Party, except if you haven't registered with any party, you're a non-affiliated voter, you can choose to vote in one of the two major parties' primary. So we have three options there, and there are further variations that I don't want to delve into too deeply, such as that the major party can opt in some states to actually allow independents to vote in their primary, and whether they do or not is different in different elections and in different states. But open primary, all voters can choose which party primary to participate in. Closed primary, only a person registered with a party can vote in that party's primary. And a semi-closed or semi-open primary, unaffiliated voters have the option of whether they want to participate in a major party's primary, but any minor party followers cannot do so. So that is the old definition of an open primary. Now let's look at the more recent version of open primary. More recently, open primary has come to mean a primary in which, as here in California, as I described a little bit ago, all of the candidates, no matter what their party is, and all the voters, no matter what their party might be or what their political leanings might be, participate in the same primary election. All the candidates are running together and all the voters get to vote. Then the top two, or maybe the top four or top five vote getters go on to the general election. This, in the past, has been called by various names a blanket primary, meaning one big blanket over everybody, a jungle primary because everybody is fighting to the death to get on the general election ballot. A unified primary is a term that's come up, I think, in the last 20 years, meaning that there's, instead of separate primaries for different parties, there's just one big primary that unifies all the candidates as being in that same primary. More recently, I've heard the terms all-candidate primary, which is kind of clear, all the candidates in one primary. And then a people's primary is another term that's been used, at least by one person that I've heard, so I assume other people as well. So there are different names in the past for this. The idea is, again, that all the candidates, all the voters participate in one big primary, and then there's some selection method for determining who goes to the general election. Let's take a look. First of all, let me say where I think this is coming from. There is an organization called Open Primaries. You see here, if you're watching the video, their website, a page on their website stating their mission. open primaries, and their mission is no American should be required to join a political party to exercise their right to vote. That is, they're focusing in on this big set of independents who cannot choose the nominees of the major parties who will end up on the general election ballot. So what they want to do is get rid of the party primaries and bring all candidates together in the same primary and give all voters, including independents as well as minor party voters, the opportunity to select which candidates actually advance to the general election ballot. So that's their mission, but they changed their name to open primaries, I guess, because it sounds more descriptive and more positive. Open, it's open to everybody rather than closed to some big subset of voters. So that's where I think this is coming from, the organization promoting this. And let's take a look at where this is again from their website, and this is how the presidential primaries are currently set up in the various states. Now, if you're not watching the video, you won't be able to see the distinctions here, but I've had to add in the phrases in blue to make it clear the old meanings of the old labels for these and the labels that this open primaries outfit is using. So the closed primary is, just as I said, the states in which you have to be registered with the party in order to vote in their primary. About half of them. There's a lot there in gray across much of the West Coast. Now that's the presidential primary, not any other offices, just the presidential primary. In some states, they have what the open primary people are calling an open partisan primary with partisan registration, what I have called a semi-open or semi-closed primary. And we see those in the light orange color. So there's maybe 10 of those are semi-open primaries, what they're calling open partisan. And then finally, the deeper orange, they call open partisan with nonpartisan registration, what I called an open primary. That is, generally the state does not require a voter to register with the party in order to vote for a major party's in a major party's primary to choose their nominee. And there are quite a few of those. I say maybe close to 20 of those in which voters can ask for the ballot of a particular major party's primary. All right, so that's how it looks now in the presidential race. Now, it is different in the congressional races, and this is really where the movement is focused on, from the congressional level down to the lower offices. Here, they've added, so they have those same three categories: closed primary, open partisan, which I've called the semi-open or semi-closed primary, and the open partisan, which I've called open primary, the previous usage of that label. And they've added this top 2, top 4 open partisan, which I've called a blanket primary. So there are a handful of states that now use this method where all the candidates and all the voters participate in one big primary. The states of Nebraska and Louisiana have had these for a while. In Louisiana, it's actually not even a primary. They use the blanket primary concept in their general election. That is, in the general election, all the candidates run together and all the voters vote among those. If somebody gets more than half the votes, they're the winner. And I would assume in Louisiana that's generally a Republican. But if no candidate gets more than half the votes, then they have a runoff election sometime after the general election. So it's not actually a blanket primary, but it is a blanket general election with a runoff in a later election if needed. In Nebraska, the blanket primary, or what they're calling an open primary, only applies to state legislative races and not actually to congressional races. Now, California, Washington, and Alaska are the cases in which this was a recent change. California, I think, added this concept of what's now being called an open primary in 2010, and then Washington followed a couple years later, and Alaska a few years later, but with a twist. In both California and Washington, you have this so-called open primary in which all the candidates participate and all the voters participate, but it is a top two system in which only the two top vote getters go to the general election, and those are your choices. So the method of choosing the general election winner is pretty simple. Whoever gets the most votes of those two candidates, somebody has to get a majority unless it's it's a literally equal number of votes between them, which would be rare. But the top two go to the general election, and whoever in the general election gets the most votes is the winner. That's Washington and California. Now, in Alaska, they've done something different. They have this open primary, but then the top four go to the general election. Now, what is the voting method to choose the winner in the general election? Well, you would think that maybe the one who gets the most votes wins, but what they're trying to do is avoid the split vote problem. Remember, let's go back to that story of the American Independent Party. Let me just put it over the top of that other one. In the American Independent Party, because there are two Republican candidates who are running in the primary, they split the Republican voter base between them, giving them each fewer votes than the American Independent Party candidate. So this is the issue that you can split the vote. Open primaries means that a set of voters with very similar views, when they have more than one candidate who seems close to their views, those voters got to choose between those, giving each of those candidates fewer votes than they might have gotten if they could consolidate the vote behind one of them. So what we see here is Washington and California have a top two system with a blanket or open primary, and Alaska has an open primary, but more than two candidates go to the general election, and they have chosen to combine it with ranked choice voting to determine that final winner. So ranked choice voting comes into the picture at that point. That has been the trend in a lot of these recent reform initiatives. So in several states, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, there are initiatives or referendums that have put the question to the voters in those states whether they want to move to this type of open primary in which all the candidates and all the voters participate without discrimination based on party. The candidates all have the same requirements for getting on the ballot, a certain number of signatures and maybe a filing fee, and all the voters, without regard to their party preferences, get to choose among those candidates, and a certain number go to the general election. So a lot of these recent initiatives are combining it with ranked choice voting. So thinking again of that American Independent Party candidate that got on the general election ballot because there were two Republican candidates who each got a little less than that candidate did. If you had a top four system, the candidates in the general election would have been the Democrat, the American Independent Party's candidate, and the two Republican candidates. So all four of them would have made it, somewhat lessening the problem of the split vote in that open primary. And then you have to have a way of choosing between those four candidates that's not going to repeat the split vote problem that they had in the primary. So you use ranked choice voting to try to avoid that, or at least lessen the possibility of it. There are cases where you can have a split vote in the general election. It happened actually in Alaska in their congressional election using ranked choice voting and the open primary, because you had two Republicans who were in the final round of counting, and they divided their votes between them and made it such that both of them lost, actually, to the Democrats. So a little more complicated than that. But ranked choice voting generally mitigates the spoiler problem in, I don't know how many elections, but the majority of them. So it is used in combination with the open primary. The thought is, we'll have the split vote in the primary, but we can avoid its repercussions by getting more than two to the general election ballot. And then we use ranked choice voting. It also has the fortuitous side effect of bringing two different movements together to support one measure. That is, all the people who like the open primary concept because they want independents to have more of a say in who gets to the general election, and all the supporters of ranked choice voting who see it as a solution to the spoiler problem get together to get behind one measure. So what is happening in this coming election in terms of the kind of reforms that are being proposed? And I took this particular graphic from, I don't remember her name, but it was on a university panel that was online a week or two ago, and I made a screen grab of this because I wanted to keep it for myself, but I find it's good for using in this video, and I wish I was giving credit. I hope the person doesn't mind because I am spreading further the idea of the open primary. You see there are efforts to change in the light green. The states in light green, as well as the District of Columbia way over on the East Coast, have measures on the ballot to change their elections process. The dark green are the states I already mentioned that have some form of a blanket primary or a blanket general election, that is Alaska, California, Washington, Nebraska, and Louisiana. So those I've already discussed. The ones in light green are the ones that currently have these on the ballot for voters to determine in this election. And I'm going to break it down different than that chart on the right so that it's a little easier to comprehend. In only one of these states are they proposing the top two system that we have in California and Washington, and that is in South Dakota. South Dakota, you see down there at the bottom of the list, has an all-candidate primary. That is what I've called a blanket primary and what the open primaries group is calling an open primary. They have an all-candidate primary with the top two going to the general election. So South Dakota is following in the footsteps of California, Washington, and Nebraska. The second set of them would be Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada, all these western states. They have open primary or a blanket primary with the top four or top five going to the ballot in the and using ranked choice voting in the general election. So let's look at them down in Colorado and in Idaho. They have a top four, and in down there in Nevada, they have a top five. Both of them very similar. They're going to have a blanket primary, an open primary, or what they're calling on this chart the all-candidate primary. And you get to pick one candidate, all the voters, all the candidates in one primary election. And then the top four or top five advance to the general election, and they use ranked choice voting to determine the winner in the general election. Then we have Montana, which has a all-candidate primary with the top four, and they say a majority winner requirement. Now what that means is that they want to avoid the split vote problem to some degree in the all-candidate primary and advance four candidates to the general election, but they're not sold on ranked choice voting yet. They're leaving it, I think, to the state legislature to determine what method they want to use in that top four general election. It could be ranked choice voting, or it could be something else, like approval voting, in which voters can pick, they can say yes or no to each of the candidates, or star voting, in which you get to give scores to the candidates. And in Montana, they're leaving that an open question. They're just saying there's going to be a top four election, and then later on we'll decide how we're going to choose in the general election. And in the District of Columbia, it's different yet. They're going to have a semi-open, which I've also called semi-closed primary, in which each of the major parties, their own voters plus unaffiliated voters, can choose to vote in one of the party primaries. And then they've combined that with ranked choice voting in the general election. I forget whether they've got top four, top five, or how they're doing it. But you see variations of this. That's the main point here. Each of these has a different combination of the open primary, blanket primary, all-candidate primary idea, and then combining it with either a top two or more than two with some form of majority voting, like ranked choice voting or approval voting or something else in the general election. So there's variations, but what they're doing is they're combining two different types of reforms in order to address different types of problems. What is my opinion of all this? I don't think it is the optimal reform. Here in California, I have issues with the fact that I only have two choices in the general election, and because I moved here after the primary, I didn't have any chance to participate in that open primary. So that's a little, that ticked me off a little bit. That's kind of a strong way of saying it, but it makes me feel like my vote doesn't count much if I don't want if I don't want to vote for a Democrat or a Republican. I do have the choice in the presidential election because they are not included in this reform. In the case of California, anyway, it's different in the different reform measures. Anyway, but in the primary election would be the main thing. This gives an opportunity for a minor party or independent candidate to actually get on the general election ballot and maybe even show, that they have a significant level of support. So the primary is going to be where the open primary system shows its potential for advancing challenges to the two-party system. And if minor parties or independent candidates took advantage of that and worked really hard to get a candidate elected, say, to the Congress or to their state legislature, using the primary to consolidate their vote, really focusing hard on a particular district to get voters to vote for that candidate of their party, and then actually get on the general election ballot. That's one step that shows they are more of a realistic contender. And then even maybe eventually to win in a general election, that could be a means of changing the two-party system. So in that sense, I like the open primary. I would prefer if they used something like approval voting, where you can choose to vote for any of the candidates in the primary you like, so that people don't feel like they still have to say, well, I want to determine, make sure the Democrat gets to the ballot, so I'm going to vote for the Democrat, even though maybe I might like the Green Party candidate. With approval voting, you say yes to the Democrat and to the Green Party candidate, or yes to the Libertarian and less to the Republican. That is, you get to vote for any candidate you like, yes or no, across the board. You could even say yes to all the minor party candidates and no to the Republican and Democrat candidates. So I would like it if they combine approval voting, if they keep the open primary concept. I think that would be an improvement over it. But there's other more complicated ways to do that as well. I won't even try to walk you through that at this point. And in the ranked choice voting thing, I think there's better methods than ranked choice voting. The big rap here for me, the biggest one, is that when you move away from the two states that currently use ranked choice voting in statewide elections, which are Maine and Alaska, those have very small populations. Ranked choice voting is very difficult to do unless you bring all the ballots together in one place to count them. In Alaska, because most of the voters are concentrated in the area of the capital, Juneau, it's easy to bring those ballots physically together in one place. And in Maine, it's a relatively geographically small state as well. And with a low population, there's not that many ballots to be counted, so they can bring all those ballots together. When you get to a bigger state, and that with a higher population, like Colorado, for example, you're going to have a hard time bringing ballots together all across the state or finding voting machines that can handle the tabulation requirements. Because remember, you cannot do the second round of counting in ranked choice voting until you're finished with the first round of counting to see whether or not there's a winner and which candidate's going to be eliminated. Maybe you don't remember that, or maybe you didn't see my previous episode, but it's a hard process to do, to implement in a realistic way. That's the main rap against ranked choice voting in my mind, and there are systems that they could use like star voting, which would be much easier to implement and get done. There's other reasons I would prefer something like star voting to ranked choice voting, but I'm not going to get into that now. It's already complicated enough. Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about the open primary concept, the Open Primaries group is holding an online, as they call it, rally on Monday, October 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, which, if I'm correct here, is 3 p.m. Pacific Time. And they've highlighted in orange the same states where those initiatives are on the ballot. And they're having it hosted by the president of Open Primaries, John Updike, and Andrew Yang, who many of you remember as a Democratic candidate for president, who later founded the Forward Party, yet another minor party which does not have ballot access anywhere. But they're going to be discussing these initiatives. So if you want to learn more about that, particularly if you live in one of those states, that would be a good thing to sign up for. It's free, and you could learn more and maybe wrap your mind around this a little bit better. So that, as I'm losing my voice once again, that is my presentation for today. I will be back at least on the weekend in the next few weeks looking at how the presidential race is going, if anything particularly interesting or significant happens. Otherwise, talking about what's going on in the various states with these reform measures on the ballot, or seeing what else I can come up with, which may be interesting to talk about. I do want to talk about the two-party system, why we have a two-party system, what is the foundational reason. So I'll be sticking that in somewhere. Be watching for that. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for commenting. I love to get your comments, hear what you have to say. That's it for this week. Signing off. Goodbye, and have a good week.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus, the moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.